Okay, that's done. And I'll flip the little part. Okay, I think there hasn't been anyone trying to get in for the last minutes, so I think we'll start. Okay, so welcome to the last CIUHCT lecture of this semester. Today we have with us David Salomoni, who is known for most of the audience. He was a former, well, he's still a member of the RUTTER Project and a researcher at CIUHCT. He's now an assistant professor in the history of education. Let's see, if at the University for Foreigners of Siena. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
it is.
Right. So you was awarded the Bernard Berenson Fellowship for the Harvard University Center of Renaissance Studies at Villetati. And in 2012, he was an Andrew Mellon Fellow at the University of Oklahoma. And in recent years, in very recent years, he worked on the ERC RUTTER Project, of which most of the team is here present at this moment. So without any further delay of it, you have the...
Thank you, Luis. Okay, I will share my PowerPoint because no good presentation can be without the PowerPoint, right? Okay. Okay, can you all see it and hear me all right? Okay, cool. Thank you for being here. And I will start my presentation by saying that although the title of my presentation may seem pretentious, I found fascinating the idea that 17th century Tuscany could represent a privileged observatory to explore some dynamics and conflicts that during that time served as a background to the affirmation of a new conception of the world. Among the main features of the time, not only the presence of personalities such as Galileo Galilei, but also the existence of a dynasty of princes, the Medici, that have always been at the forefront of technological, artistic, and philosophical progress. The geographical centrality of the region in the Italian peninsula and in the center of the Mediterranean made Tuscany the ideal place for the circulation of men and ideas from the rest of Europe, as we shall see, but also dangerously close to the control of some radical fringes of the Roman Inquisition. In this context, some religious teaching orders, therefore, found the best ground to settle and carry out their educational program in the wake of the heterodox and heretical tendencies of many humanist teachers of the 16th and 17th century. The short journey I would like to take you on today, therefore, unfolds through different disciplinary fields, from the history of science, of course, to the history of scientific communication, up to religious, educational, and cultural history. Hoping not to bore you too much, I would like to begin with the event that inspired my paper. In 1646, with the brief Eque Pro Felici, Pope Innocent X reduced the Piarist order from a religious order to a simple congregation of priests under the jurisdiction of their bishops and without the possibility to accept new novices. In other words, the pontiff decreed the death of the pious schools created by Joseph Cazans at the beginning of the 17th century. In this regard, however, a question arises. What led the papal authority to such a radical decision? At a time when the militant church triumphed, at least in its perspective, precisely thanks to the reorganization of the Catholic identity around a new educational paradigm, why crush precisely one of the orders that best embody this ideal? This problem has created debates among historians. Some have argued that it was a plot warped by the direct rivals of the Piarists on the educational market, namely the Jesuits, while other historians have thought that perhaps this action should be contextualized as an anticipation of the inquiry wanted by Innocent X in 1649 for the reformation of Italian religious orders. The flow of events that determined the investigation and finally led to the 1646 brief seems to justify this hypothesis, at least partially. The inquiry was entrusted to Silvestro Pietrasanta, a Jesuit. In addition, in 1645, the Florentine ambassador in Rome received an anonymous letter from an elderly Jesuit declaring that all the investigation had been decided by his fellows. In the first half of the 17th century, the pious schools also suffered from major internal problems due to the impetuous initial development. This factor was certainly a further cause for the papal survey. However, on a closer look, the investigation had begun under the predecessor of Innocent, namely Urban VIII. In 1633, he had Galileo Galilei condemned to abjure his thesis in support of heliocentrism. Perhaps not by chance, a few years later, the incidents that led to the investigation against the Pierists started exactly in the Florentine Pious school, which were closely linked to Galileo and his environment. The plot was triggered by Mario Sozzi, a Pierist arrived in Florence in 1640. He was now at his 8th move in 8 years, as Paul Grendler said, a sure sign of troublemaker. The Florentine stay was no exception, and Sozzi was immediately involved in disagreements with his brothers and decided to retaliate. The pretext was offered by the close attendance of 5 Pierists of Galileo Galilei's retreat house in Arcetri. In 1641, Sozzi denounced his 5 fellow clerics for teaching heretical theories, including heliocentrism, atomism, and denial of God's omnipotence. Among the brethren accused by Sozzi, there was Famiano Michelini, future algebra teacher at the Medici court. In the light of this context, it is possible to hypothesize that the link between the Tuscan scientists and the 5 Pierists could have been a decisive element for the resolution to investigate more in depth what was taught in the Pious school. In particular, the mathematical teaching of Famiano Michelini may suggest if and to what extent Galilean theories were disseminated among those who were attending his school in Florence. Federica Favino expressed a concept underlined by Maurizio Sangalli, according to which the scientific modernity of the Pierists is still to be investigated, and each case study must be assessed individually. The purpose of this paper, which cannot and does not intend to exhaust a topic that is too broad and articulated, is to include Famiano Michelini's mathematical teaching activity within 2 historiographical issues. The first one, obviously, relates to Michelini's teaching activity with respect to Galilean scientific theories. We are here at the crossroad between the history of science and the history of education. The second one relates to how can we include Michelini and his willingness to spread heliocentrism within a medium-term perspective in which 16th and 17th century school teachers were at the forefront of the dissemination of ideas of a doctrinal and scientific character persecuted by the Holy Office. The importance of the relationship between Michelini and Galilei is ascertained. As Federica Favino wrote, after a brief stay in Rome, in November 1629, Michelini was sent by Calasanz to Florence to participate in the organization of the schools that were to be established in the Grand Duchy. After obtaining the Grand Duke's permission, the school opened on May 22, 1630, and Michelini went there to work as an abacus teacher. By 1633, the mathematical school was in operation with its own classroom at the Pierist professed house in Santa Maria dei Ricci. Until 1648, Michelini included among his disciples young people of the Florentine aristocracy, such as Carlo Dati, Valerio Chimentelli, Candido and Paolo del Buono, Simone and Filippo Paganucci, and young professed such as Angelo Morelli, Salvatore Grise, Clemente VII, and Giovan Battista de Ferraris. Thanks to an introduction who described him as a young scholar and a virtuoso in some part of the mathematics, in Florence, Michelini met Galileo and his disciple and became, to habitually attend the Villa Il Gioiello in Arcetri with some of his fellow Pierists. In addition, the two expeditions to Rome in 1633 on behalf of the order were for Michelini as many as opportunities to expand his Galilean relations. In Rome, in fact, he became familiar with the Benedictine father Benedetto Castelli at the monastery of San Callisto and of his guest, the young Giovanni Alfonso Borelli, and perhaps Evangelista Torricelli and Raffaello Maggiotti. In particular, with Maggiotti, Michelini not only shared his mathematical curiosities, but also his enthusiasm for the discovery of blood circulation. That, he said, it was enough, as Maggiotti wrote to him, to turn to all medicine. In 1645, Michelini entered the court as a palace master, expert in hydraulic matters, and since 1638, thanks to Galileo, he became algebra master of the young brothers of the Grand Duke Ferdinand II of the House of Medici and Giovanni and Carlo Leopoldo, to whom he taught Euclid and the modern science of motion. According to some of his biographers, it was the Medici themselves who demanded from Calasanz the priestly nomination for Michelini, which caused so much disarray in the order. On November 11, 1636, in fact, Michelini and the mathematician Ambrogio Brogi received the priesthood for extraordinary merits, an ordination normally denied to the workers' brothers and then granted, in fact, with papal permission. The investiture rekindled the controversy of the excluded to the point of inducing the General Chapter of 1637 under the presidence of the Congregation for the Apostolic Visit to prohibit any further mobility within the order and to impose on the newly ordained priest the suspension of the title and the obligation of papal absolution, which they obtained on January 7, 1638. It was shortly after that, in 1641, together with Settimi, Ambrogi, Morelli, and Carlo Conti, that Michelini was denounced by his brother Mario Sozzi at the Florentine court of the Inquisition as a follower of Galileo and Copernicanism. His immunity as a servant of the Medici dukes prevented him from appearing at the trial, which moreover absolved Clemente VII, who was the only remaining accused at the time in Florence. The frustration for what had happened, however, was at the origin of his hard renunciation of obedience to Sozzi when he became the provincial of Tuscany. Michelini then left the Florentine Pierist convent and entered the Medici Palace in January 1642, and he became the head of the refusal of the House of Pisa to submit to the obedience to Sozzi and his successor. In the turbulent years after 1642, which, as said, ended with the Innocentian brief Eaque Pro Felici, with which the pious school were lowered to a congregation without superiors, Michelini, unlike those who choose to leave the religious habit, continued to work despite 1,000 difficulties for the good performance of the schools of Pisa and Florence, and in September 1648, he replaced Vincenzo Renieri on the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa. According to custom, on November 5th, he gave the inaugural lesson of his course, in which he claimed, we know from a few years later, that every knowledge is mathematic. Although we do not have direct documents proving Michelini's teaching of heliocentric theories in his school, at least between 1629 and 1635, some later sources make it legitimate to adhere to this hypothesis. In a famous letter written in 1638 by Galileo to Michelini, indeed, the famous scientist said, "The Grand Duke was informed of the glass so much celebrated by you and already by Mr. Dino Pieri, and you will have understood the will of His Highness that I think he will be want to see it. The observation of Mars that you mentioned to me is so beautiful, and even more so what you write of the small but beautiful stars that will come to be supremely minor, not only of what astronomers have seen generally, but of what I still had judged, which is really a great consequence." Further evidence of this relationship is given by Sozzi's own complaint to the Holy Office. In fact, he wrote about Michelini and his companions that of all of them believed that there is no science truer and more certain than the one Galileo teaches, following the mathematical way, calling it the new philosophy and the real way to do natural philosophy. The above mentioned, and Father Francesco Clemente and Ambrogio in particular, have often said that this was the true way to know God. And time and again, Father Clemente tried to convince me to take up the study of their theories. They said that this philosophy had been proved and that it was the true way to convert the heretics and to know God. However, in order to clarify the picture, let us try to better contextualize these statements about Michelini and his companions. Sozzi, in fact, accused Michelini of thinking mathematics as an instrument to approach God as a direct consequence of his heliocentric theories. Such a way of thinking was not uncommon among Michelini's contemporary scientists. As Volker Remmert wrote, in fact, nearness to God was explicitly stated in order to legitimize the mathematical sciences by many of Galileo's contemporaries. Among them, we remember John Kepler, who even considered the mathematical way as a kind of divine service. There were even other disciples of Galileo, for example, Niccolò Aggiunti, who also believed to serve God mathematically. More cautious was Evangelista Torricelli, who after Galileo's trial in 1633 knew about the risks into which discourse about the divine and mathematics could lead. In addition, Galileo's Dutch sympathizer, Martin van den Hoof, who could freely confess to the close neighborhood between mathematics and the divine. There were also scientists who belonged to religious orders, such as the Jesuit mathematician Giuseppe Biancani and Charles Malapert, both of whom clearly saw the nearness to God and their epistemological perfection guaranteed the progress of the mathematical sciences. It has to be taken into account that after the trial of 1633, the profession to close links between the mathematical and the divine may have been prevented by fear of ecclesiastical intervention, at least on the Italian scene. In addition to the world of professional mathematicians, there is also another factor to consider in order to better understand the impact on society of Famiano Michelini's schools, his students. A better understanding of the audience interested in Michelini mathematical teaching would clarify the real extent of the threat perceived by Rome compared to the possible spread of Galilean approaches in contemporary society. Federica Favino, in her biography of Michelini, also reports some names of Florentine nobles and notables who attended his school during the early years. To these, we could add the brothers of Ferdinando II of the House of Medici, of whom he became private teacher of arithmetic in 1635. Among these, there was Leopold, future cardinal, but great scientific enthusiast and close to the thought of Galileo. This character, perhaps, is not the most representative to get an idea of the real effect on society of Galileo's thought through the teaching of Michelini, but he was still part of this mechanism of transmission of ideas. He was influenced by his teacher. He had founded the Platonic Academy in 1638, and in 1657, together with his brother Ferdinand, he also opened the Cimento Academy, according to his precise idea of scientific research based on direct observation of the facts, an application of the Galilean scientific method. After the scientist's death, he also tried to rehabilitate his figure, but without success. Among other students of Michelini, another interesting profile is represented by Clemente VII. Settimi was not only a pupil of Michelini, but also another Galilean piarist who attended Arcetri with the other brothers and was active in the Famiano school. Later, he was also denounced by Sozzi to the Inquisition together with Michelini and other three piarists. Settimi was an excellent geometry teacher. Among his followers in Arcetri, there was Vincenzo Viani, who later also became an important scientist. Other students who attended Michelini School were Paolo and Candido del Buono. Paolo received his doctorate in Pisa in 1649, and during his studies, he visited the imperial mines of the Carpathian, inventing a method for extracting water. He dealt with many physical and experimental problems, and his name figured with that of his brother Candido among the members of the Accademia del Cimento, of which he was a correspondent from Germany. Candido, on the other hand, was a camerlingo of the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, in the Accademia del Cimento. He presented various instruments of his own invention. It is not clear from the documents whether he or his brother Anton Maria were responsible for the invention of the so-called Archicanna, a complex system that solved some of the problems typical of large telescope from the second half of the 17th century. Not only mathematicians and scientists, however, attended Michelini School. Valerio Chimentelli and Carlo Dati, for example, were respectively a jurist and a philologist. The first had graduated in utroque iure in 1643, preferring to become a law teacher instead of a lawyer. In 1648, he was defeated by Carlo Dati in the competition for the chair of classical languages in Florence, but in 1649, he obtained the chair of Greek at the University of Pisa. The second was, it is true, a scientist, but also a philologist. In 1648, he taught classical languages at the University of Florence in the competition in which he prevailed against his former fellow student Chimentelli, and in 1663, he also became secretary of the Accademia della Crusca. A particular aspect of these two former students of Famiano Michelini can be traced back to a very important moment in their lives, which perhaps can indirectly tell us something more about the intellectual imprint left to them by the Piarist father. In 1638, indeed, the two scholars met John Milton, together with other Florentine intellectuals. For the English poet, Chimentelli and Dati were not just some of those very kind Florentines who welcomed him into that society of scholars who were the heirs, in his perspective, meaning Milton's perspective, of the ancient splendor of their predecessors and worthy successor of Dante. In particular, Carlo Dati deserved and occupied the first place in Milton's regard. As author of a book about the lives of painters and the leading member of many academies, Dati was to become one of the most widely known and popular of his contemporaries. Carlo Dati, at the time of Milton's visit, was only 19 years old, not much after having been a student in Michelini School. The poet's friendship was warmly returned, as is shown by their late correspondence. A further evidence of Dati's continued interest in Milton and of the poet's pride in his approval is to be found in the verses published among the Testimonia, which Milton used as a preface to his Latin poems in the edition of 1645. The language is extravagant, but not for that reason unsincere. Dati hails him as a new Ulysses, who had, whether in mind or body, surveyed the whole world of civilization, as a polyglot on whose tongue the ancient languages lived again, and as a philosopher who had listened the music of the spheres. The voice of fame is inadequate to spread his virtues, and the astonishment of men too faint a witness to his excellence. The Italians were skilled in nothing so much as in the art of compliment, and Milton, of all men, was the least likely to take their praises. However, Dati and Chimentelli became in retrospect the focal point of Milton's Florentine visit. The two former students of Famiano Michelini were fascinated by Milton's religious and political ideas. The English poet, indeed, supported a very subjective and original theological thought. A few years after his visit to Florence, for example, Milton wrote his famous work, The Reason of Church Government Urged Against Prelacy. Published in 1642, this political work details Milton's preference for a Presbyterian approach to the Church of England over approaches favored by the episcopal organization of the time. Milton states that this form of worship stems from Hebrew scriptures. Chimentelli and Dati are even remembered in another work by Milton, The Second Defense of the English Nation, Defensio Secunda pro Populo Anglicano, published in 1654, the second in response to an anonymous royalist booklet entitled The Cry of the Royal Blood to Heaven Against the English Parricide, a work that made many personal attacks on Milton. In this book, Milton praised Oliver Cromwell, now Lord Protector of England, while exhorting him to remain true to the principle of the Revolution. Another interesting element about Milton's visit to Florence is his meeting to Galileo, which somehow symbolically closes the circle between Dati, Chimentelli, Michelini, Galileo, and the Milton. It is mentioned in the Areopagitica, where Milton is speaking of the freedom of the press and of the discouragement which restraint of publication brings to learned men, contrasting Italy in this respect with England. As Milton's right, I could recount what I have seen and heard in other countries where this kind of inquisition tyrannizes. When I have sat among the learned men, for that honor I had, and been counted happy to be born in such a place of philosophic freedom as they supposed England was, while themselves did nothing but bemoan the servile condition into which learning amongst them was brought, that this was it which had damped the glory of Italian wits, that nothing had been there written now these many years but flattery and Faustian. There it was that I found and visited the famous Galileo, grown old, a prisoner to the Inquisition for thinking in astronomy otherwise than the Franciscan and the Dominican licensers thought. And though I knew that England was then groaning loudest under the prelatical yoke, nevertheless, I took it as a pledge of future happiness that other nation was so persuaded of her liberty. Whether Milton's visit to Galileo had actually took place has been questioned on the ground that the astronomer was ill when the poet was in Florence, and that he was being closely watched by the Inquisition, and that he himself, for fear of consequences, exhibited the utmost docility in his confinement. It is difficult to believe that Milton would have gone out of his way to invent the incident, and the known facts do not warrant us in thinking that the visit was impossible. Milton's contacts in Florence, indeed, were the ones most likely to promote a meeting between the poet and the astronomer, Carlo Dati and Chimentelli, for example. This hypothesis emphasized the intellectual attitude of these two former students of Amiano Michelini. Most important, the moment of Milton's meeting with Galileo is to be found, as we all know, in a celebrated passage in Book 1 of Paradise Lost, where the poet links the huge circumference of Saturn's shields to the moon, whose orb through optic glass the Tuscan artist views at evening from the top of Fiesole or in Valdarno to descry new lands, rivers, of mountains in her spotty globe. His later discussion of issues between the two systems of the universe reflect the new astronomical knowledge at every point. The arguments advanced at the beginning of the 6th book of Paradise Lost are those of Galileo's dialogue, which involves acquaintance not only with the general truth that planets have their radiance from the sun, but also with Galileo's discovery that Venus had phases like the moon. This digression on Milton's passage from Florence and this meeting with Galileo aims to show the circularity of scientific theories in Florence in the first half of the 17th century and their spread. This diffusion, as I assume, was favored by the activity of schools such as that of the Piarists, in which the minds of individuals such as Dati and Chimentelli were forged, so important in encouraging meetings between personalities such as Milton and the master of their master, Galileo. But right now, you might be wondering, where is, speaking historiographically, the link between Chimentelli, Dati, and Milton with Galileo, the Piarists of Florence, and the School of Mathematics of Amiano Michelini? The answer is as follows. The first half of 17th century in Europe was a moment of particular conflict and tension, politically, religious, culturally, and scientifically. The 30-year war was underway, the civil war in England was about to break out. Giordano Bruno had been burned in 1600, and Galileo was forced to abjure in 1633. The situation was hot, and hanging out with a person like John Milton in Florence was not something to be taken lightly. This tells us something about the cultural predisposition of Michelini's two former students and lead us to get into a new long-term perspective to consider his school of mathematics. School teachers, in fact, since the beginning of the 16th century, had been an elusive category difficult to control by religious authorities. Their claim of an active role in shaping society, therefore, passed from the 15th century political commitment to that of the individual conscience. School teachers soon became one of the most insidious and uncontrollable categories on the part of the inquisitorial tribunals. In 1525, Ludovico Ariosto, in his satire on the search for a private teacher for his son, alluded to the Pecadillo di Spagna, the Spanish sin, that is, the rather widespread anti-Trinitarian tendencies of school teachers. The profession of faith imposed in 1564 by Pius IV to all school teachers then was just the formalization of the generalized suspicion of the ecclesiastical world towards humanists, generally considered as a catalyst responsible for many young pupils' initiation into Protestant and anti-Catholic doctrines. In 1560, the young Jesuit Antonio Possedino, during his mission in Piedmont, a northwestern border area close to the very Protestant Geneva, therefore a special surveillance area, had identified the school teachers as a group on which to exert special pressure for his campaign of systematic Catholicization. He distributed among them the catechism of his fellow Jesuit Peter Canisius. In 1561, Possedino wrote from Vercelli that he had given 500 copies of Canisius' catechism to school teachers to give them to school children, while in 1563 he obtained an edict from the Duke of Savoy, Emanuele Filiberto, stating that all teachers were obliged to a public confession of faith. This was even a year before the general profession imposed by Pope Pius IV. And this text was to be copied and posted in every classroom and explained by teacher both in male and female schools. In 1621, Eliseo Masini Sacro Arsenale, one of the most durable and influential inquisitorial manuals in early modern Italy, we still find written that doctors, school teachers, and confessors who have abjured as suspects must not return to their first offices if not of express order and by the grace of the Supreme Pontiff. The professions listed by the famous inquisitor are placed in a delicate intersection between the care of the body and the care of the soul. The school teachers participated in both functions, taking care of the intellectual and therefore moral education of the individual, but also of his physical activity in society, contributing concretely to the common good with the education that they gave. The role of school teachers in the diffusion of Protestant doctrines in 16th century Italy, in fact, proceeded in two ways. On the one hand, these humanists owned the intellectual tools to understand and access books containing the ideas of the German reformers. Sometimes the more cultivated among them even participated in the cenacles and intellectual circles where these ideas were discussed. In doing so, they served as a transmission belt between the elites in which the principles of the Reformation took root initially with the urban populations where such ideal were spread like wildfire. On the other hand, the school teachers had the pedagogical tools to introduce many young people to the ideas of the Protestant Reformation, rooting these principles in them. Giovanni Maria Tagliati, a school teacher known as Maranello, for example, living in Modena, was an addicted reader of Serveto and a fervent anti-Trinitarian. He was indicated by all his accusers as an initiator of his pupils to the new spirituality. He was the author of a grammar text, the Compendium Rei Grammatice, published in 1549 by the printer Gadaldino, indicating how a real production of reformed school books existed. From this trial paper of heretical teachers emerges a plot of dense relational ties with the Italian and foreign spiritual communities thanks to the circulation of students coming from beyond the Alps. Years later, during other pastoral visits carried out in the 1590s by Possevino in Casale Monferrato, Mantua, and Reggio Emilia, the Jesuits still distributed pious and devotional books to school teachers, strongly admonishing them to eliminate pagan antiquities from their teaching and suggesting the reading only of Horace, Virgil, and Terence, whom himself had studied. So, coming towards the conclusion, and this is the main point I want to make with the paper. Famiano Michelini was not among the school teacher trialed for spreading Protestant doctrines in his school, but some traits of his teaching activity can be compared to some of the features that I've just listed. He was active in a urban and densely populated environment. He had access to intellectual circles of high social level. He was teaching dangerous theories in his school, which he used in shaping his students' mind. Eventually, he was also investigated by the Holy Office. The only difference with the previous century school teachers concerned the content of his forbidden teaching. Michelini just shifted from strictly doctrinal contexts to scientific contexts, with nonetheless huge religious and doctrinal implications. Michelini was doubtless a man of his time. He was not struck in the past. His treatise on the direction of rivers, an important work on the canalization of running waters, shows how his engagement in the resolution of practical problems concerning the development of the economy of his time through the changing of rural structures. Economics, politics, philosophy, science, and religion thus merged in the profile of a school teacher who perfectly embodied the tension and characteristics of an era and its educational culture. With Famiano Michelini, we can say that we passed from the age of a doctrinal heresies to an age of scientific heresies in schools. In conclusion, during this presentation, I have not provided new data nor shown new sources useful to add new pages to an already known history. However, one of the most important tasks and the most interesting aspect of the historical disciplines is to provide new interpretation and contextualizations of phenomena. This is the operation I have tried here today, to provide the school of Famiano Michelini with a new contextualization and interpretation by putting it in the background of a broader historical path. Speaking historiographically, my guess is that the school and teaching activity of Michelini could be integrated in a perspective that sees school teachers as the cultural, political, scientific forefront of their times. the contents of their dangerous teaching might change depending on the most critical issues of their time. Religious doctrines during the 16th century, scientific theories during the 17th centuries, up to political ideas during the 19th and 20th century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your great talk. Now we have some time for the comments. So the audience can just raise your hand and just turn the microphone. Or also you can write in the chat and then we can read the question or the comment.
Please be good. But I stayed within the 40 minutes limit I anticipated, right?
Oh, that's fine. The time is great.
Ooh,
thank you.
great.
So does anyone like to start? Oh, Sarah, please. No. Are we? You need to turn your microphone. Sarah, we are not listening you. Yeah, now I think you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed for giving me, as an English historian of cartography, a very interesting and helpful context about the religious and the scientific and the educational context of Florence in the early to mid 17th century. I have two particular questions which derive from what you've said, and I wondered whether I'm right in thinking that Giancarlo Medici was the admiral, not necessarily the Tuscan nomenclature, of the Knights of San Stefano, the Tuscan Navy. Is that, have I got that right? Or don't you know? He becomes a cardinal, but he had a professional role as the admiral of the Navy. Actually, if I've got the right Medici, he was the brother. Yes.
You catch me a little bit unprepared under that regard.
Okay, well, that's fine. It's just that he was, and he leads me to my next question, and that is, in your context, and obviously there were Englishmen there in Florence and Pisa, and in my case, my interest is in Livorno, where the Navy was.
Right.
Have you ever, in talking about, I'm going to get his name wrong, what's his name? Michelini?
Michelini. Yeah.
Have you ever come across the work of Robert Dudley, who was there from 1608 to 1648 when he died, who produced the Arcano del Mare? And he was a great friend of Torricelli. I'm not aware that he ever actually met Galileo, but he obviously, from his court connections, knew Leopoldo, and if not a member of the Cimento, which is a bit after his time, he knew the people of the Crusca. But has he turned up in any of your researches?
Actually not, but that's a really interesting lead. Actually, I mean, it's clear, it's almost obvious to say that under this regard, Livorno is it's really a place that must be investigated. And actually, I have not come across a link such as the one you're mentioning, but that's a lead that I think I should investigate. Livorno.
Please do.
I will. The thing is, I'm trying to assess with this paper, but in general also, following other research leads, is to consider schools as centers, minor, if compared to university. I mean, when I say minor, I refer to the educational level, not the importance of the schools themselves. But it's interesting to see how schools of religious orders, Jesuits are the most studied, but there are many others that deserves attention. I was saying schools as centers of encounters, centers of production of knowledge, not always heterodox knowledge, but also, you know, peripheral knowledge, both in scientific and religious terms, and see how these schools, the secondary level schools worked in disseminating knowledge. But what you suggest is really interesting, and I will tell you for sure if I come across something.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you for the question.
Does anyone else would like to ask a question or make any comment? We still have some time. So perhaps, please, Professor Henrique.
No, thank you very much. Thanks for the talk, David.
Yeah.
This is a little bit peripheral, but can you tell us a little bit more about the Pierist involvement with science, you know, regardless of this? I mean, because we know how this happened in the Jesuits, but for other religious orders, this very, you know, peculiar thing, which is the fact that the religious order gets involved with the teaching of science, and then they develop scientific practitioners among their own members. How did this come about with the Pierist thing?
Yeah. So this is really interesting, and your observation, Eric, really it's the central problem of this paper. So as I was saying, this is not an excuse, but I mean, we can talk freely among us. As I was saying initially, I made this survey, you know, for this lecture recently. So I wasn't able to dig really much into the scientific aspect, but this is exactly the point. Meaning, I was triggered. My interest was triggered by the research of Federica Favino and other scholars who touched the Pierists and their activity, saying they claim that orders such as the Pierists deserve more attention if compared, for example, as we know, and I said this, to the Jesuits. Apparently, and this is not the answer to your question, but it can partially answer, or at least give some ideas where we could look at. For example, some argues that as a juxtaposition to the Jesuits that were perceived as rivals, the Pierists were instrumental later on, after this semi-suppression that they suffered at the half of the 17th century. Some historians, I was saying, suggest that the spread of Newtonianism in Italy was favored by the very Pierists in juxtaposition to the Jesuit, and that in this use that they made of Newton's theories, they sort of built an identity as a religious order that allowed them to reconnect with their previous, let's call it heritage, as assistant or as an order close to Galileo. So it's not just about science. It is also about their own role and their own identity. And this happens also with other religious order, such as the Barnabites. In the late 17th and early 18th century, the Barnabites also become involved in the interest of Newtonian theories, And this is surprising because the Barnabites, for example, were born, you know, at the beginning of their history when they were founded. They didn't even want to be involved with teaching or schools or anything connected to knowledge, because all these religious orders were born as, you know, in the wake of the spiritual renewal of the Counter-Reformation. And so they feared knowledge as a form of pride, and they aimed at spiritual purity. But at a certain point, they start opening schools and they start being involved with science. And this is also another very interesting thing. So really something that should be done by historians. And this is a task, you know, that should bring together historians of science and historians of education, because in the experience of these religious orders, science and education are very closely linked. A wider survey of the nets, you know, of the schools and the exchanges of people and knowledges among the schools of religious order that were non-Jesuits, I think could be an interesting perspective, an interesting path of research.
So just to clarify, so Federica Favino studied especially the Piarists.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. At least some years ago. I don't really know where she's at right now, but until like 4 years ago, she was focused on Piarists, and yeah. So yeah, even online, there is this resource, the Dizionario Biografico degli Italiani, where her entry about Fabiano Michelini is freely accessible, but it's really informative. Also because she provides at the end of the entry all the existing bibliography until the moment she wrote it. So that's interesting and useful.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment? So I would like to ask just a question, it's just a curiosity. Once again, thank you so much for your presentation. It was a great. And at the beginning of your presentation, you prepared some biographies, and you show us some of the figures that you used in your study. We are aware that in those times it was more a male world, of course, but it is interesting to see that there was just male figures. So I was just wondering if you find any clue or any evidence that any woman in your research, is there any what is the woman participation in those processes, or that until now there is no evidence about that? It's just what I was wondering. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. So yes, this is a real good question, and my fellow friends, scholars here know that, you know, I'm also sensitive to the topic of the women's role in the historical experience that I study. In this case, you're right. We don't find any woman coming out from the text. Mainly it's because, speaking of religious orders, of male religious orders, this doesn't mean that at that time there were no religious teaching congregation led and created by and for women. So there were both in the 16th and in the 17th century. I think of, for example, in the 16th century, Ludovica Torelli, or in the 17th century, the congregation of the Venerini nuns. But as for the, let's say, part of scientific teachings in their school, I haven't found them. I haven't found them. The thing is, I dedicated a part on female schools in the book I published in 2021 about women's about religious orders and their schools, and there's a part on the schools led by women. The thing is that when we talk about religious teaching congregation in that time, it was already and so I mean spread congregation, not isolated cases, not particular case studies, but on a wider level, it was already hard for them to create, and they did create, a network of schools that could go beyond the teaching to girls of more than reading and writing. I mean, I'm speaking at a wider level. Then we have cases of women scholars in Bologna and in major cities. But on a wider level, it was really hard to go beyond the simple teaching, the simple literacy, you know, of writing and reading, which nonetheless made those enterprises worthy, you know, of being noticed by their contemporaries, because even in the majority of cases, and I know I'm going far from the scientific side of the question, but since you asked, I thought it was worth mentioning it. But it was already a conquest for them, because those schools, the schools created by women and for women, were meant as safe spaces for the girls to, let's say, a form of self-determination. In the statutes of those schools was explicitly written that those schools, those spaces were needed, you know, to save the girls from pressures coming from their families. And for the majority of them coming from rural environments, the liberty to decide whether to get married or entering a convent, well, for many of them was a conquest. So I know I have not answered your questions, but there is also a network, thick and widespread, of female schools, and with female teachers. Oh, okay. Sorry. I want to add just one thing. Just one last thing. I won't steal you too much time. But now that I think about it, and this is the hardship of the research into the field of the history of education, because we're talking about networks, but every case should be investigated individually. So I was thinking, for instance, in this novitiate that I have studied, which is in my hometown, Guastalla, a very small town, unknown to the most of the world, and which makes it even more interesting. So in the novitiate that hosted orphan girls, but also wealthy girls of the town. So in that school, the girls were taught several subjects, and among the subjects it's listed in their statutes, it was taught geography, for example. And if we say geography in the 17th century, we say geometry, we say arithmetic, we maybe say astronomy. So there are hints. They are scattered, more scattered if compared to men's school. But if we go into every single case, we would find interesting answers to the question you asked.
Yeah, that point is very interesting. Thank you for sharing. So does anyone else would like to ask a question or a comment? So Luis, do you like to say something?
Well, if no one else has a question, we just want to thank David.
Thank you.
Or
I mean, I really miss you. I don't want to be sentimental, but really, well.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. Well, I conclude this CIUHCT lecture and the last one of the term, and we'll see each other at some point, and for new CIUHCT lectures sometime in September or October. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
David.
See you soon.
Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you.